It's my pleasure to introduce our host and moderator, Dr. Leonard Sachs. Dr. Sachs is the founder of CITC and is the visionary behind it all, and he currently serves as the Associate Director for Clinical Methodologies Office within the Office of Medical Policy at CDER. Please help me to welcome Dr. Sachs.
Thank you very much, Brenda. Welcome to everybody. Congratulations for reaching the third day of our 2024 course. So just to take stock, we began our course 2 days ago with a review of clinical trials, the design and analysis. We spoke about the use of clinical trials to evaluate the safety and efficacy of medical products. We had a discussion on safety considerations, and we also spoke about specific populations that may participate or should participate in trials. Yesterday, we changed track and we spoke about some of the basic science supporting clinical trials. We spoke about product quality, manufacturing and quality controls. We spoke about clinical pharmacology and toxicology and general pharmacology. We had a couple of lectures on innovative trial design and informed consent, and we ended off with some of the innovative areas in product development. So today, we're going to focus on another critical aspect of clinical drug development, which is trial quality, reliability of data, and investigator responsibilities. These are fundamental focus for FDA, and they're described fairly extensively in our regulations. We're very grateful to the Office of Scientific Investigation for putting together today's program. We're going to begin with a lecture by Cheryl Grandinetti on clinical trial quality. We're going to move on to a lecture by Miah Jung on investigator responsibilities. And finally, recognizing the importance of international trials and the fact that almost all our trials have some sort of international footprint, Kasa Ayolu will cover the important topic of international clinical trials. So at this point, let me hand over to Cheryl for our first lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. We're going to start off today by talking about what fit-for-purpose clinical trial quality means and how it's achieved. Also, I want to focus my presentation on the importance of clinical trial quality through the lens of the clinical investigator and the sponsor investigator. So today, we'll discuss FDA's perspective on clinical trial quality and data quality that is fit for purpose. We'll talk about how quality by design and risk proportionality principles are applied in the design and conduct of clinical trials. We'll discuss implementation of risk mitigation strategies and proactive measures at the site level to avoid protocol noncompliance and errors that matter. And then I'll provide a case example that illustrates the benefits of adopting quality by design and risk proportionality approaches to the design and conduct of clinical trials, both from the clinical investigator and the sponsor investigator perspectives. So how does FDA define clinical trial quality? Well, unfortunately, you won't see a definition for clinical trial quality defined in our IND regulations under 312. So what I have on this slide is the closest that I can point you to in our regulations that specifically discusses quality in a clinical trial. And that's under 21 CFR 314.126, which broadly describes what constitutes an adequate and well-controlled study. So what's on this slide is the primary basis for determination of whether substantial evidence of effectiveness has been provided to support the labeling claim. FDA does review protocols submitted under an IND prospectively to assure that the study is adequate to permit evaluation of the drug's effectiveness and safety. So we can also turn to guidance to better understand clinical trial quality. ICH E8 Revision 1 or R1 is an international guideline that was issued in 2021 and discusses general considerations for clinical trials. This guideline describes internationally accepted principles and practices in the design and conduct of clinical studies that will ensure the protection of study participants, and help with the acceptance of data and results by regulatory authorities. The guideline provides recommendations on how to build quality in the design and conduct of clinical studies across the product life cycle, and this approach is also known as quality by design. It helps us to understand quality in the context of how trials are conducted. And the guideline states that clinical trial quality is considered as fitness for purpose, which means that the quality and amount of information generated from the clinical trial should be sufficient to support good decision making. I also want to acknowledge the contributions of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITI, in this quality by design space, as they have been working on this quality by design approach for over 15 years. CITI is a multi-stakeholder public-private partnership that was founded by FDA and Duke University in 2007. To help us further understand this idea of quality as fit for purpose, CITI also defined quality in clinical trials as the avoidance of errors that matter to decision making. Specifically, we're talking about the errors that could affect the safety of trial participants or the credibility of trial results. So this is another way to help us understand quality in clinical trials. So if we delve into FDA regulations under 312 and our guidances, it is clear that multiple parties play an important role in trial quality. So it's the sponsor who designs and oversees the trial and analyzes and reports results. It's the contract research organization to whom the sponsor has transferred their responsibilities to. It is other service providers that are contracted by the sponsor and CRO to perform critical clinical trial activities. It's the IRBs who provide initial and continuing review and approval of research. And of course, it's the clinical investigators. So those of you who translate a trial from the pages of the protocol into the clinic, you have a very important role in delivering quality. And it is your day-to-day work engaging with participants and carrying out protocol requirements and collecting trial data that are the foundation of trials that yield quality data and reliable study results. So now let's go back to ICH E8R1 to further explain this fit-for-purpose clinical trial quality, which is rooted in the foundational principle of quality by design. And quality by design entails proactively designing quality into the design and conduct of clinical trials to ensure the protection of the rights, safety, and well-being of study participants, the generation of reliable and meaningful results, and the management of risk to the study's critical to quality factors using a risk proportionate approach. And this last bullet encompasses a lot, and I'm going to talk about this in detail throughout my presentation today, and I really hope it's not to the point of ad nauseum. But at its core, this last bullet really entails identifying the critical aspects of a trial, specifically the critical data and processes, and directing efforts towards these factors. This approach ensures that we effectively address what is essential for generating credible and reliable data while protecting participant safety. So initiating the QBD process, or the quality by design process, during the design phase of the trial is crucial for its success. And again, this is another point that I'm going to underscore throughout my presentation, because I believe this is where the process often falters or goes wrong. So first, why is this done at the design of the trial? Well, the goal of a clinical trial is to generate reliable information to address research questions. Clinical trials are vital for drug development, and a well-designed and executed clinical trial is not only essential for regulatory decision-making, but also for evidence-based healthcare decisions. Conversely, a poorly designed trial or an ambiguous protocol can lead to a poorly conducted trial and introduce significant issues such as compromising participant safety, producing inadequate or unreliable evidence that could impact decision making, wasting resources and the time and efforts of investigators and participants, and it may not align with ethical standards. So to further illustrate this point, imagine starting with what appears to be a perfectly constructed house. However, if the foundation and structure aren't built properly, issues begin to surface as you start using the house. Similarly, in clinical trials, if quality is not built in from the start, issues can arise during the study. And we really want to avoid that firefighting approach where you're scrambling, making hasty decisions, applying quick fixes without thorough investigation, and addressing symptoms rather than root causes. What we want to prevent is a study plagued with data integrity and reliability issues, a study that might look something like this house. And this could lead to rejection of the data or even the entire study, and it could jeopardize regulatory approval and even result in the discontinuation of potentially beneficial therapies. So the protocol serves as the blueprint for ensuring quality. So for those sponsor investigators in the crowd who are designing trials, during protocol development, you really have the opportunity to de-risk the protocol and avoid risks to the data and participant safety. So design is really the point where you can identify those critical aspects of the trial and take steps by tailoring the design to avoid the kind of errors that impact regulatory decision making. And it gives you the opportunity to engage with key stakeholders to get their input. Protocol design and development is also an opportunity to ask, why have we included this? Whether it be, data collected or some procedure being conducted. And it gives us the opportunity to streamline the trial where feasible, to reduce the burden on sites and other study personnel. It's also that last checkpoint to verify that the trial you've designed will answer that important scientific question you had in mind when setting out to design the trial. And it gives you the opportunity to highlight important risks that are not eliminated through study design and that may be mitigated through the trial's operational plans and procedures. So we say that you should avoid errors that matter. And what errors matter? Well, they are the errors that impact your study's critical to quality factors. So what are these critical to quality factors? Well, ICH E8R1 defines them as attributes of a study whose integrity is fundamental to the protection of study participants, the reliability and interpretability of the study results, and the decisions made based on the study results. So we're talking about critical data, critical design elements, and critical study processes and procedures. If their integrity were to be undermined by errors in design or conduct, then the reliability or ethics of decision-making or the results of the study would also be undermined. So really, in simple terms, the question we need to ask ourselves is, what do we really need to get right to ensure the reliability of results and patient safety? So for those sponsor investigators in the crowd, you should conduct risk assessments to identify and review the critical to quality factors during the design and planning of your study, and then re-review and reassess them throughout study conduct, analysis, and reporting. So these critical to quality factors are individualized to your study and study design, and inflexible one-size-fits-all approaches should be avoided. So simply identifying all studies to always have the same broad categories of critical to quality factors should be avoided. The critical to quality factors should be communicated to all those involved in the trial conduct to ensure a shared understanding and alignment on what is critical to quality and the quality expectations. So let's move on to challenge question 1. So which of the following best defines the concept of quality by design in clinical trials? A reactive approach to quality control that addresses issues after they occur. B, a proactive approach that emphasizes designing quality into the trial from the outset. C, a method focused solely on data collection and statistical analysis. Or D, an approach that prioritizes regulatory compliance over participant safety. So I think this is an easy one. The answer is B, a proactive approach that emphasizes designing quality into the trial from the outset. So the next challenge question, 2, in implementing quality by design, which of the following elements is most critical for ensuring clinical trial quality? A, randomization of participants. B, a comprehensive understanding of the study's critical to quality factors and potential risks to those critical to quality factors. C, strict adherence to standard operating procedures. Or D, extensive documentation of all trial activities. And I think the obvious one, again, and an easy one is B, comprehensive understanding of the study's critical to quality factors and potential risks to those critical to quality factors. Okay, so let me pivot now to ICH E6R3, which is a draft guideline, and it's an international guideline for good clinical practice. So you'll hear more about this updated guideline, revision 3 in particular, from Dr. Ayalu this morning in his presentation that follows mine. And this guideline has been totally reorganized and renovated to include 11 principles and 2 annexes. So Annex 1 provides recommendations on how the 11 principles can be appropriately applied to clinical trials. And Annex 2 provides additional considerations on how these principles may be applied to clinical trials that incorporate various operational approaches, such as trials that use decentralized or pragmatic elements and use real-world data. So the purpose of the E6R3 update is to provide recommendations that can be applied across the broad range of clinical trial designs and settings. These updates are intended to address the complexities of clinical trials in the current global regulatory climate and to facilitate modernization, harmonization, and innovation in clinical trial design and conduct. So the guideline is grounded in these concepts of quality by design and risk proportionality, and it supports fit-for-purpose clinical trial quality. Adopting these approaches, so quality by design and risk proportionality, is what allows flexibility in applying the E6R3 principles and recommendations. And this requires critical thinking to tailor solutions such that they are fit for purpose for your clinical trial. So the appropriate measures are taken based on the specific risks and needs of the study to ensure the overall study results and participant safety. So here are the 3 foundational principles of the 11 that are in ICH E6R3. And these 3 in particular support this risk proportionality approach. So at a high level, Principle 6 focuses on quality by design, highlighting that quality should be integrated in both the scientific and operational aspects of clinical trial design and conduct. Principle 7 stresses that trial processes should be implemented in a way that's proportionate to the risk to participants and to the importance of the data collected. And then there's Principle 8, which advocates for simplifying protocols to ensure operational feasibility and to reduce burden on sites. And so it's all of these principles together that help to minimize unnecessary burden on participants, on sponsors, and on investigators, and to ensure that resources are allocated effectively and efficiently by focusing on what matters most to quality, again, to participant safety, and to yielding reliable results. So the overall message that I'm trying to convey is that quality by design is the essential ingredient to managing trial conduct proportionately. Your study plans and processes should all be guided by your quality by design approach, your identified critical to quality factors, and your risk assessments. Your risk assessments and your management processes should be iterative and adjusted when new risks emerge. And errors to critical trial data or participant safety should be addressed as early as possible through risk-based monitoring, or ideally prevented altogether by building quality into the design of your trial. Much of what I presented on today occurs during the trial design phase and really falls on sponsors and those sponsor investigators in the crowd to design a clinical trial that is scientifically valid, ethically responsible, and focused on producing reliable data that can be used for regulatory decisions. For those clinical investigators in the audience, though, you might be asking, what's expected of me as a clinical investigator, and how do I apply the principle of risk proportionality to my responsibilities? Well, first, it's crucial that you and your clinical trial staff understand what's critical to quality for a study and the potential risks to those critical to quality factors. You should focus resources and investigator oversight on those critical data points and high-risk areas, so data and processes deemed critical to quality, and ensure that the data is credible and reliable and that the critical processes are conducted according to the protocol. You should assess risks throughout the study, adapting practices as necessary to respond to new information or unforeseen challenges that may arise in study conduct. So now I'm going to present a case example on the use of electronic diaries in a clinical trial to illustrate how applying risk proportionality to the study design and conduct can help to focus resources on what's critical to quality and to improve data quality. So this is a hypothetical case, but unfortunately many parts of this case have been taken from actual cases. So two pivotal trials were submitted to FDA to support approval of an investigational drug as adjunctive therapy in patients with a seizure disorder. The two trials were similar in design and were multi-center randomized double-blind placebo-controlled studies. The primary efficacy endpoint in both studies was the change in the mean convulsive seizure frequency during the treatment period compared to the baseline period. The primary efficacy endpoint was an observer-reported outcome that measuring seizure frequency, as I indicated just now. Both protocols pre-specified and described the use of e-diaries by the caregivers to directly enter daily seizures. And the intent was for the parent or caregiver of the study participant to contemporaneously document their seizure, the daily seizures into the e-diary. And the sponsor contracted with a service provider to provide caregivers with the e-diaries and to manage the e-diary data. So this slide illustrates the e-diary data flow, and I'm just going to walk you through the diagram to provide a basic understanding of this study conduct. So each day, the caregivers recorded the daily seizures of the subject, including the dosing of the study drug and the use of rescue medications into the e-diary. And the e-diary data were transmitted electronically from the devices to the service provider's database. If the e-diary device was connected to a Wi-Fi or a mobile data signal, then the diary data was automatically sent at the end of completion of a diary entry. If the e-diary did not have Wi-Fi or a mobile data signal, then the diary data was stored temporarily on the device until Wi-Fi or a mobile data signal was available. So investigators had read-only access to the e-diary database, and they couldn't enter or make changes to the e-diary data. The service provider was responsible for reviewing and managing the e-diary in the database, and they could make backdoor changes. And these backdoor changes to the data were tracked in the ECOA database audit trails. So, for example, if the service provider in the review of the data identified discrepancies, errors, or missing data points, they would generate a data query and would send the query to the site via an online portal. If the query resulted in a change to the eDiary data, then the investigator had to authorize the data change and did this by completing a data change form in the online portal. The service provider then retrieved and reviewed the change form, and once they had all the information they needed, the service provider would change the data in the system. And again, this was all tracked via the system audit trails. So once all the data changes were made and the data were reconciled and cleaned, then the service provider transferred that clean data file to the sponsor for incorporation in the SDTM datasets and for analysis. So during the CI inspections, the inspectors reviewed the audit trails of the eDiary data that were retained at the site. They observed that a portion of each participant's eDiary data was entered by the service provider as much as 1 year after the date that the seizure data should have been contemporaneously entered by the caregivers, so as much as 1 year after the date that the seizure occurred. So why was this done? Well, towards the end of the trial, the sponsor noticed that there was more than an expected amount of missing data and asked the clinical investigators to retrospectively collect this data to mitigate the amount of missing data. So the clinical investigators and the study staff did this by conducting in-person and phone interviews with the caregivers. The clinical investigators also collected the caregivers' personal diaries and notes. So these personal diaries and notes were not designed for use in the trial, but the caregivers typically kept these contemporaneously personal diaries and notes as standard of care for these patients. So first, let me just say up front, when I talk about these inspection observations, that we found almost little to no issues with the data quality for the data that was entered directly into the devices by the caregivers. And then for this data that was retrospectively collected, we just there was so much of it that we just didn't want to throw it all out. So in order to determine the reliability of the seizure data that was entered retrospectively in the ECOA database by the service providers, we had to look more closely at the source, which were these paper diaries, the caregiver's personal paper diaries, and also other paper records at the site. So it was the progress notes and medical records where this clinical investigators documented their interviews with the caregivers. So these source records were not consistently maintained or retained at the site. So there were a lot of missing source records to support the seizure frequency data that was submitted to FDA. In addition, multiple discrepancies were identified between the source records that were available and the seizure frequency data reported to FDA. So the root cause for the discrepancies in the source data the source records that were available was multifactorial. So first, the first cause was that the caregiver's personal diaries did not collect all the protocol required information. So they didn't collect the time and type of seizures, they didn't document the dosing, or they didn't document the use of rescue medications. So it was really difficult to verify, the information that the service provider entered into the ECOA database because there was just no source available to support all of the information that was entered. The second cause for the discrepancies stemmed from the service provider staff who was responsible for entering the retrospectively collected data in the database. So they misinterpreted the data change forms that were completed by the clinical investigators, along with the copies of the caregiver's personal diaries that were sent to them, and they frequently consolidated multiple seizure events that occurred on a day into a single seizure event. So, there was a large volume of data that needed to be entered by the service provider, and this, simply was not a planned part of the study. And the service provider staff, really was not adequately trained or qualified to accurately interpret and input this data. So what was the cause of the missing data? So let's go back and talk about that. Well, there were eDiary device design, malfunction, connectivity, and transmission issues that were experienced during the conduct of the trial that were not adequately and promptly addressed by the service provider or the sponsor. There was poor caregiver compliance of the eDiaries for many reasons. There were no contingency plans in place for device malfunctions and connectivity and transmission issues. So, for example, they could have had a backup device when the devices malfunctioned, or they could have had a procedure in place to enter data in the web-based portal for those malfunctions, or they could have used a telephone or IVRS system when there were connectivity and transmission issues. So I think our data reliability assessment and its implications are pretty obvious, but we determined that the clinical investigator had retrospectively collected a portion of the eDiary data for 96% of the randomized subjects in the two studies. Again, this collection occurred up to a year after the seizures had occurred. And, I honestly can't remember what I had for breakfast, let alone what I ate a year ago. So, there is the potential for recall bias here. And so this affected approximately 20% of the seizure diary for the two studies. And because of the potential for recall bias in this retrospectively collected seizure data, this data was considered unreliable, and so a post hoc sensitivity analysis was performed by both the applicant and the FDA on the primary efficacy endpoint with respect to this retrospectively collected data. So what were the lessons learned? Well, first, sponsors or sponsor investigators should conduct risk assessments at the study's outset to identify critical to quality factors and the risks of the critical to quality factors. Sponsors and clinical investigators should prioritize resources and implement targeted strategies for high-risk areas to maintain data quality. So for this case, focus should have been placed on the seizure frequency data, in addition to the many critical processes involved in its collection. So for example, the sponsor could have placed more focus on the design of the eDiary devices or validation of these devices. It could have placed more focus on help desk support, developing contingency plans, and conducting centralized monitoring of the eDiary data to identify this missing data sooner. And for the investigators, they could have placed focus on caregiver training on the proper use of the eDiaries, monitoring for missing data on their end, and perhaps better reporting to the sponsor of issues the caregivers were having with the use of the devices. Sponsor and investigator oversight should be adjusted based on the assessed risk. And because this was critical data, for example, more frequent reviews of this data by both parties could have helped address some of the data quality issues as they arose in the trial. The sponsor and clinical investigators should communicate quality expectations to ensure there's a shared understanding among all team members. And then both parties should foster open communication about potential issues for quick responses and adjustments to data collection practices. So this is one more bonus question because I really want to drive this point home. How should the principle of risk proportionality influence the allocation of resources and the implementation of risk mitigation strategies? A, all processes should be standardized regardless of the level of risk involved. B, risk mitigation strategies should be minimal, as extensive measures may hinder the trial's progress. C, resources should be concentrated on high-risk areas and critical data points with appropriate risk assessments guiding decisions on acceptable levels of risk. Or D, the importance of data should be assessed only after the trial is completed based on the outcomes. So, of course, the answer is C. Resources should be concentrated on high-risk areas and critical data points. And then finally, my closing thought that I'd like to leave you with, and that is achieving fit-for-purpose data quality largely hinges on the foundational principles of quality by design and focusing on what matters to participant safety and the reliability of the overall study results. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to present at this clinical investigator training course, and I'm happy to take questions during the panel session.
Hello, good morning. Thanks for joining me. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. My name is Miah Jung. I am a clinical pharmacologist in the Compliance Enforcement Branch, and I work with our earlier speaker, Cheryl Grandinetti, and our next speaker, Kasa Ayalu, in CDER's Office of Compliance, Office of Scientific Investigations. In this half hour, I will be speaking on investigator responsibilities. Here are the learning objectives. First, we'll run through good clinical practice standards and FDA regulations governing clinical trials. And next, I'll highlight clinical investigator responsibilities for clinical trial conduct and clinical trial quality. I'll briefly discuss clinicaltrials.gov requirements and what your role or involvement might be as a clinical investigator with respect to reporting clinical trial information on clinicaltrials.gov. Throughout, I'll aim to expand on Cheryl's earlier messaging and how risk proportionality applies to clinical investigator oversight of clinical trial conduct. Under FDA's regulations, a clinical investigator is defined as an individual who conducts a clinical investigation. So that is like under whose immediate direction the drug is dispensed to a subject. In the event an investigation is conducted by a team of individuals, the investigator is the responsible leader of the team. Under FDA regulations, a sponsor investigator is defined as an individual who both initiates and conducts an investigation, and under whose immediate direction the investigational drug is administered or dispensed. The requirements applicable to a sponsor investigator include both those applicable to a clinical investigator as well as those applicable to a sponsor. For the context of this clinical investigator training course and this session, I will be speaking to the clinical investigator requirements and responsibilities. So clinical investigators. Clinical investigators hold a critical role not only in driving medical innovation, driving advancements in medical knowledge, treatment options, but are entrusted with ensuring the safety of study participants, the integrity of data, compliance with regulatory and ethical standards in clinical research. They're central. They're central to the clinical trial environment, engaging with many different parties as shown here. Clinical investigators serve as key connection points between the study participant and the trial. Clinical investigators engage with the sponsor, engage with the IRB. FDA has an important role to play in overseeing clinical trials and verifying data submitted to FDA to ensure they're reliable and ensuring that study participants are protected. FDA does this through reviews of protocols and through clinical site inspections. So FDA's legal framework. FDA's legal framework in which clinical investigations are designed, conducted, overseen, and reported starts with the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Section 505I is the statutory authority for FDA's oversight of clinical investigations to test safety and effectiveness of investigational drugs. CFRs, or Code of Federal Regulations, include regulations describing FDA's authority over the conduct of clinical investigation. whereas guidance documents represent the agency's current thinking on a particular subject. These are not regulations, not laws. These are advisory only to assist regulated entities in complying with regulations. An alternative approach to what may be described in a guidance document may be used if the approach satisfies the requirements of the applicable statute and regulations or both. So FDA's regulations are intended to ensure the integrity of clinical data on which product approvals are based, and are intended to help protect the rights, safety, and welfare of those who participate in clinical trials. FDA expects clinical investigators to know the relevant regulations and understand the clinical investigator responsibilities and to adhere to those regulatory requirements. I will highlight and cover some of these clinical investigative requirements that fall within these regulations pertaining to clinical trials and good clinical practice. Here is a sort of snapshot of some of the clinical investigator responsibilities and relevant 21 CFR regulations. I leave this here as a resource for you, but again, I'll discuss certain key clinical investigator requirements that fall within these regulations pertaining to clinical trials in the next few slides. So before we go into some of the key responsibilities for clinical investigators, I wanted to quickly touch on this slide again. It's a slide that you saw during Cheryl's session about risk proportionality expectations for clinical investigators. Clinical investigators should ensure a comprehensive and shared understanding of the study's critical to quality factors and potential risks to those critical to quality factors. And the 2 points I really want to focus on are the two last ones: focusing resources and investigator oversight on critical data points in high-risk areas, and assessing risks throughout the course of the study and adapting practices as necessary to respond to new information or unforeseen challenges that might arise in study conduct. We'll touch on this here and there through the rest of this presentation. So investigator responsibilities, they're highlighted and laid out in the statement of the investigator, the Form FDA 1572. FDA regulations provide that no investigator may participate in an investigation until he or she provides the sponsor with a completed, signed statement of the investigator. I encourage you to read closely Section 9 of the 1572. It contains 8 important commitments that the investigator agrees to by signing the form. Each of these highlight key expectations of the agency. In signing the 1572, the investigator is agreeing to adhere to the approved protocol with limited exceptions. The investigator is agreeing to ensure potential participants are appropriately consented in accordance with our human subject protection regulations at Part 50. By signing the 1572, the investigator is agreeing to ensure IRB review and approval, committing to prepare and maintain accurate and adequate records, among other things. Under FDA regulations, the clinical investigator retains ultimate responsibility and is required to maintain appropriate supervision of the trial to ensure data reliability and protection of study participants. The investigator is held accountable for study conduct, including those activities that he or she may delegate to members of study staff or service providers. This really underpins the need for the clinical investigator to supervise a clinical study and to make sure that study staff and associates supporting trial conduct are aware of their obligations. As Cheryl had highlighted in her discussion on risk proportionality expectations of clinical investigators, it's critical that investigators ensure sufficient resources available to appropriately conduct the trial, focusing those resources and investigator oversight on critical data points in high-risk areas. The level of investigator oversight of the delegated activities should depend on the nature of the delegated activities and be proportionate to the importance of the data being collected and the risks to trial participant safety. So with respect to delegated trial activities, the investigator should maintain a record of delegated trial activities. So the investigator should ensure a record is maintained of the persons or parties to whom the investigator has delegated trial-related activities. Such documentation should be proportionate to the significance of the trial-related activities. So in situations where the activities are performed during clinical care, delegation documentation may not be required. The investigator should ensure that persons or parties to whom the investigator has delegated trial-related activities are appropriately qualified and are adequately informed about relevant aspects of the protocol, the investigational product, and their assigned trial activities. So with respect to trial-related training to persons assisting in the trial should correspond to what is necessary to enable them to fulfill their delegated trial activities that go beyond usual training and experience. I'd also like to note and highlight something that Cheryl had discussed in her session, risk proportionality expectations for clinical investigators includes assessing risks throughout the study and adapting practices. So that applies here as well for trial-related training. So risk proportionality expectations for clinical investigators include assessing risks throughout the study and adapting trial-related training as necessary to respond to new information or unforeseen challenges that might arise in the course of study conduct. I recommend review of this guidance document as a useful resource. This guidance document clarifies FDA's expectations concerning investigator responsibilities, including supervision, delegation of tasks to qualified individuals. IRB review and approval. So a clinical investigator must assure that an institutional review board, an IRB, that complies with the requirements set forth in Part 56 will be responsible for initial and continuing review and approval of a proposed clinical study. So IRBs have specific obligations and requirements to adhere to ensure, among other things, protection of participants' rights, safety, and welfare. Clinical investigators are responsible for submitting sufficient information, materials to the IRB so that the IRB can meet its regulatory obligations. The clinical investigator should follow institutional policies and procedures for obtaining initial and continuing review and approval of research. Informed consent requirements. Investigators must obtain legally effective informed consent of each study participant to whom the investigational drug is administered, with certain exceptions. Information should be as clear and as concise as possible. Study participants must be given an opportunity to ask questions and receive answers to those questions. Informed consent shall be documented by the use of a written consent form approved by the IRB and signed and dated by the subject or the subject's legally authorized representative at the time of consent. I'll also add whether the informed consent process takes place in person or remotely, the investigator should assure themselves of the identity of the participant or legally authorized representative in accordance to applicable regulatory requirements. Another great set of resources, I recommend you review these on informed consent. In conducting the study, the investigator must ensure that an investigation is conducted according to the signed investigator statement, so that Form FDA 1572, as we discussed earlier. The investigator must ensure the investigation is conducted in accordance to the investigational plan and applicable regulations, must ensure the protection of participants' rights, safety, and welfare, must ensure the control of drugs under investigation. The investigator is required to implement processes, measures, and approaches in a way that's proportionate to the risks to participants and to the importance of data collected. And again, focusing resources and oversight on critical data points in high-risk areas. Data management responsibilities. In generating, recording, and reporting trial data, the investigator should ensure integrity of data under their responsibility, such that data submitted to the agency can be verified for purpose of reconstructing the study. We're talking about complete, consistent, accurate, and all attributable, legible, contemporaneous. As a clinical investigator, you're responsible for preparing, maintaining, or retaining records. The investigator should know and define what is considered a source record, what the methods of data capture are, the location of the study records and the study data, unnecessary transcription steps between source record and data acquisition should be avoided. Changes to source records should be traceable, should not obscure or make no longer available the original entry. Changes should be explained as necessary, whether by some notation or audit trail. Investigators should be provided with timely access to data by the sponsor and are responsible for timely review of data, including relevant data from external sources that can have an impact on participant eligibility, treatment, or safety evaluation. That being said, the protocol may have exceptions for access, for instance, to protect blinding. So I have a pop-up challenge question. Who is responsible for compliance with record keeping and record retention requirements for electronic data remotely collected for a clinical trial? A, sponsor, B, clinical investigator, C, local healthcare provider, D, data storage service provider. The answer is B, clinical investigator. So the clinical investigator is held accountable, held responsible for record keeping and record retention requirements. Clinical investigators, again, are responsible for timely review of data, including relevant data from external sources. They should ensure that they have the means and timely access to data. So, for example, if data is being collected through a web-based portal, web-based administration software for patient-reported outcome data, as a clinical investigator, you should ensure you have timely access to be able to adhere to the regulatory requirements of maintaining those records and record retention. Safety reporting requirements or responsibilities. A clinical investigator's role in safety reporting is to promptly identify, document, and report adverse events and serious adverse events that occur during a clinical trial to the study sponsor or IRB as appropriate. It's important to know the requirements and the procedures for reporting. So again, determine if an adverse event is serious. Report serious adverse events to the sponsor immediately, regardless of whether the investigator believes the SAEs are related to the drug. Record those non-serious AEs and report them to the sponsor as specified in the protocol. Generally, FDA considers a serious, unexpected adverse event that meets the criteria for an IND safety report to be an unanticipated problem involving risk to human subjects or others, and therefore must be reported to the IRB by the investigator. Again, know the requirements and procedures for reporting. As one of the last points to discuss during our time together, clinicaltrials.gov registration and results information reporting requirements. So clinicaltrials.gov is a web-based resource managed by the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health. It provides patients, healthcare professionals, researchers with access to information on clinical studies. It's intended to help patients and healthcare providers identify potential clinical trials, help researchers identify unmet research needs, find collaborators, stay current on developments in their field. And this is all through information sharing regarding clinical trials that have completed or are underway. So while the website's been around for over 20-some years, requirements for registering and reporting results information to clinicaltrials.gov have really only been the regulations for a few years. The primary responsibilities related to clinicaltrials.gov are divided between NIH, NLM, and FDA. FDA is responsible for compliance and enforcement related to clinicaltrials.gov requirements. And the FDA is committed to promoting clinical trial transparency and will continue to advance compliance activities related to this clinicaltrials.gov database. Applicable clinical trials. So applicable clinical trials are required to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. These trials are generally controlled clinical investigations other than phase 1 investigations of any FDA-regulated drug or biological product of any disease or condition. Not all studies on clinicaltrials.gov are required to register or report results information. In fact, the databank includes a substantial number of studies, such as observational studies, behavioral intervention studies, phase 1 drug trials, among others, that are not required to be registered or report clinical trial information, but that do so voluntarily. Applicable clinical trials, as defined, again, are specifically defined and are subject to clinicaltrials.gov registration and results information reporting requirements. Applicable clinical trials are subject to clinicaltrials.gov registration requirements. So generally speaking, applicable clinical trials are required to be registered within 21 days of the first human subject enrolled. This middle column includes a subset of data elements that are required to be included in the registration submission. I'll just name a few, like the study phase, study design, interventions controls, recruitment status, primary, secondary outcome measures, location. And this registration submission information is subject to the National Library of Medicine Quality Control Review. Applicable clinical trials are also required to update clinical trial information and are required to adhere to results information reporting requirements. So generally speaking, results information is required to be reported on clinicaltrials.gov 1 year after primary completion date, which is specifically defined as the date when the final study participant in a clinical study is examined or receives an intervention to collect the final data for the primary outcome measure. There are certain exceptions or exceptions to the deadline through certification for delayed submission or extension requests. There are also requirements, again, to update clinical trial information every 12 months. I advise that you check out FDA's 3-part webinar series on clinicaltrials.gov. You can find that on SBIA or FDA's website. During the 3-part webinar series, CDER discusses relevant definitions, laws, and regulations for complying with clinicaltrials.gov registration and results information submission requirements. So who's responsible? What does this mean for you as a clinical investigator? So generally speaking, the sponsor will be considered the responsible party unless a principal investigator or clinical investigator has been designated. The responsible party is responsible for submission of registration and submission of clinical trial information, including results information on clinical trials for applicable clinical trials. Each ACT must have one and only one responsible party. If you as a clinical investigator are designated as a responsible party for registration or reporting clinical trial information of an applicable clinical trial on clinicaltrials.gov, you need to ensure you understand the expectations and the requirements. Ensure you have access to clinical trial information and the data in order to adhere to the reporting requirements. Again, I recommend you check out FDA's resources, that 3-part webinar series on clinicaltrials.gov. There are also extensive resources made available, really great, helpful resources available on clinicaltrials.gov's recently updated website. So challenge question number 2. Who is responsible for clinicaltrials.gov registration and results information submission? A, study sponsor. B, principal investigator of an investigator-initiated study. C, individual designated by a sponsor, grantee, contractor, awardee. Or D, all of the above. And as you probably guessed, D, all of the above. Again, generally the sponsor is the responsible party. For an investigator-initiated study, the sponsor investigator or the principal investigator is the responsible party. Also, an individual, such as a clinical investigator, may be designated by a sponsor to be the responsible party. So, in conclusion and summary, clinical investigators are ultimately responsible for oversight of the conduct of clinical investigations, compliance with federal law and regulations, upholding good clinical practice, and assuring human participant protection and data integrity. Again, clinical investigators are key players in driving advancements in medical knowledge and treatment options, and are entrusted with that responsibility of oversight of the conduct of clinical investigations, and are entrusted with the responsibility of assuring human participant protection and data integrity, all of which contributes to the development of new therapies and improvements in healthcare. It has been a pleasure to present during this course. I'm happy to take any questions during the panel session. At this point, I turn it over to Kasa Ayalu, Division Director for the Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation, who will speak on international clinical trials. Thank you again.
Thank you for the introduction. Welcome and hello everyone. My name is Kasa Ayalu. I am the Director for Division of Clinical Compliance Evaluation, which is a division in the Office of Scientific Investigations at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. We will be discussing about international clinical trials and recent ICH 6R3 updates in relation to your role as international clinical investigators in FDA-regulated research. The presentation has 2 objectives. The first objective is to highlight the significance of international clinical trials in FDA-regulated research from a GCP perspective. The second objective of this presentation is to discuss the ICH 6R3 updates that are relevant to your role as clinical investigators. As you all know, the contribution of international clinical trials in medical product development is generally well understood and well characterized. International clinical trials provide us access to a wide range of population across the globe, which help to improve the generalizability of clinical trial result. They also help to reduce the cost of clinical trials by accelerating patient recruitment, facilitating faster development and approval of medical product on a global scale. By conducting trials in multiple countries, the time to gather clinical trial data is reduced, and that can lead to faster regulatory submission and a quicker market entry for important life-saving treatments. International clinical trials also allow the sponsors of medical products to enter multiple markets across multiple regions simultaneously. At one time, approximately 80% of approved NDAs and BLAs had contained data from global sources, underscoring the significance of international clinical trials in FDA submissions. This reflects the increasing globalization of clinical trials, with many pharmaceutical companies conducting clinical studies across multiple countries to access diverse patient population, reduce recruitment, and lower costs. As highlighted on the previous slide, clinical trials are global, and they may be conducted under a variety of scenarios. For instance, some trials may be taking place entirely outside the United States. Also, the FDA does not require the inclusion of US participants in international clinical trials. The inclusion of US participants will be crucial for FDA evaluation, especially if the trial results are intended to support regulatory approval in the US. Let's look into the conduct of clinical trials outside the US. For trials conducted outside the United States, an IND may not be required. However, if a trial is conducted outside the US under an IND, IND requirements must be met unless they are waived. Form FDA 1572. If a clinical trial is conducted under an IND, completing Form FDA 1572, which is known as the Statement of the Investigator, is mandatory. The form shown on the right of the screen serves as a formal confirmation from the investigator that they have reviewed and understood the study protocol, agreed to follow it, and will comply with all applicable FDA regulations. It also helps to ensure that the investigators adhere to FDA requirements. Form FDA 1572 is not required for non-IND studies. Form FDA 1572 signature waiver. The FDA 1572 signature is mandatory for IND studies. Investigators conducting FDA-regulated trials outside the US may request a waiver from this requirement if local regulations forbid them from signing the Form FDA 1572. To be granted this waiver, investigators must agree to alternative commitments, including adherence to ICH 6 good clinical practice, ensuring informed consent is obtained from trial participants, and receiving approval from an independent review board or independent ethics committee. If the waiver is granted, foreign investigators can proceed with their IND studies without having to sign the highlighted section of the Form FDA 1572 as shown in yellow on the right side of the screen. Let's look into FDA's expectation of clinical investigators during GCP inspections. FDA inspections are focused on ensuring compliance with GCP and regulatory requirements. Regardless of the trial's location, clinical investigators are expected to comply with federal regulations. They are expected to demonstrate a thorough understanding of the trial, as well as to be knowledgeable about their regulatory responsibilities. Let's look into the inspection areas of focus. As stated earlier, the FDA conducts risk-based inspection of international clinical investigators to ensure adherence to GCP and FDA regulatory requirements. The inspections are designed to ensure that clinical trials are conducted with the highest ethical standards, the participant safety is protected, and that the data collected is reliable and accurate for regulatory review. The focus of clinical trial inspections include ensuring strict adherence to the approved protocol, verifying the informed consent process and IRB oversight, and comparing line listing with source records to confirm data accuracy and quality. Inspections also review the participant enrollment process, monitoring activities, and reporting to sponsor to ensure transparency and safety. Compliance with regulations such as safety reporting, financial disclosures, and protocol updates is assessed along with the proper control of investigational product and retention of records. These areas collectively ensure that trials are ethically conducted, participant safety is prioritized, and data integrity is maintained. To provide you an overview of the scope of clinical investigator inspection in a single year, we have the pie chart displayed to the right of the screen. In 2023 alone, CDER conducted a total of 445 GCP-related clinical investigator inspections related to marketing applications submitted to the FDA. About 70% of those inspections were carried out in the US, while the remaining 30% took place internationally. Most inspections for drugs and biologics for applications submitted to CDER occurred in the US and Europe. The FDA may choose to mainly conduct its inspections within the US if there are sufficient US data, there are no conflicting results between the US and the foreign data, and if there are no reports of serious scientific misconduct from foreign sites. What are the common inspectional observations? Common inspectional observations made by the FDA during international clinical investigator inspections include findings related to protocol adherence, source documentation, drug accountability, the informed consent process and procedures, and adverse drug reaction reporting, as well as issues related to IRB communication. Let's discuss now about the FDA's acceptance of foreign data and updates to ICH E6R3, as both are vital for international clinical investigators involved in FDA-regulated research. As stated before, the FDA accepts data from foreign study as long as those studies are well designed, they are conducted by qualified investigators, and comply with GCP standards. Additionally, in order to accept the foreign data, the FDA must be able to validate the data through inspections if necessary. Compliance with ICH E6 is essential in the FDA decision-making process regarding the acceptance of the foreign data from non-IND studies. Therefore, it is important to review the ICH E6 updates that are relevant to international clinical investigators. We already discussed that ICH E6 provides GCP standards to ensure that international clinical trials are ethically conducted, they are scientifically sound, and they produce reliable data. The guideline, first approved in 1996, has evolved through revisions with E6R3 currently available as a draft. The updates to ICH E6 guideline are expected to further strengthen the FDA's ability to rely on foreign data by facilitating global development of medical products. The purpose of ICH E6 updates is to modernize and update the Good Clinical Practice guideline, providing guidance for various clinical trial designs and promoting innovation. The updates aim to emphasize a risk-based, proportionate approach to trial design and conduct, while also addressing the complexity of clinical trials in the current global regulatory landscape. The development strategy for ICH E6R3 consists of overarching principles and two annexes. Annex 1 consists of consideration for interventional clinical trials. Annex 2 provides additional GCP considerations for trials that use wider range of design elements and data sources, such as decentralized elements, pragmatic elements, and real-world data. When complete, ICH E6R3 will be composed of overarching principle and two annexes. What are the key updates in ICH E6R3 relevant to clinical investigators? The key updates in ICH E6R3 include a recommendation about the use of varied approach to informed consent, i.e. the guidance recommends the use of a varied approach of informed consent, such as digital or paper or hybrid. It also has clarification about training requirement for study staff, emphasizing training should correspond to what is needed at the site for a specific study or for a specific person. The guidance also clarifies expectation regarding the use of computerized systems provided by the sponsor versus those available at the clinical practice site. It also further clarifies the expectation for sponsor investigators regarding the use of service providers during the conduct of clinical trials. ICH E6R3 update clarifies expectations regarding identification and maintenance of source records and timely data review both by clinical investigators and sponsors. The key updates also contain clarification about requirement for delegation documentation. For example, Where the clinical trial activities are performed in accordance with routine clinical care, delegation may not be needed. What's next for ICH 6R3? The next one draft of the updated ICH 6 guideline has been published in May 2023, and the Annex 2 is currently under development. The final E6R3 guideline will replace the current E6R2, which has been in effect since November 2016. A training program for ICH 6R3 is being developed to provide clarification and supplementary explanation. A couple of challenge questions to test our knowledge on international clinical trials and regulatory expectations. I'm going to read the questions for you, and once I have finished reading, you may identify the best answer from the options provided. Challenge question number 1. Which of the following statement is true regarding clinical investigations conducted outside the United States? A. Investigator must always submit an IND to the FDA. B. All clinical trials must adhere to FDA regulations regardless of location. C. IND submissions are only required for phase 3 trials. D. Investigators are not required to conduct their investigations under an IND. The correct answer for challenge question number 1 is D. Investigators are not required to conduct their investigations outside the United States under an IND. Moving to the second challenge question, which is about validation of clinical trial data submitted in marketing application. Challenge question number 2. Why is it important for the FDA to validate the data from clinical trials submitted in marketing applications? A. To determine whether the clinical trial participants were compensated appropriately. B. To determine the commercial value of the product and ensure it will be profitable. C. To guarantee that the clinical trial investigators receive appropriate compensation for their work. And D. None of the above. The correct answer for challenge question number 2 is D. The other 3 choices were incorrect. The FDA validated the data from clinical trials submitted in marketing applications to ensure that the data are reliable for evaluating the safety and efficacy of the product. To wrap up this talk, I would like to share with you a couple of take-home points. As discussed during the presentation, international clinical trials are vital for generating data to support drug approvals. As clinical investigator, it is important to fully understand FDA regulatory requirements and ICH 6 good clinical practice standards to ensure successful trial conduct and data acceptance by the FDA. Here are some helpful resources that may help you further explore about international clinical trials and ICH 6 updates. Thank you all for your time and attention today. It has been a pleasure to share the information about international clinical trials and ICH 6 updates with you. Should you need to get in touch or have follow-up questions, you may contact me using my email address provided here.
Thank you very much to our speakers, to Cheryl, Miah, and Casa for a very detailed overview of trial quality and considerations, the responsibilities of investigators in international trials. We've got a lot of questions from members of the audience. So the first question, let's see, is addressed to Cheryl, and the question is, are we moving towards more risk-based monitoring? Cheryl, any thoughts?
Thank you so much, Leonard, for that question. That's a great question. So FDA has really been promoting risk-based monitoring for the past 15 years. In 2013, we published a final guidance on risk-based monitoring, which covered oversight of the clinical investigation. And then most recently in 2023, we also published a Q&A guidance on risk-based monitoring. So, at this point, we do expect sponsors to implement risk-based monitoring and to be using risk-based monitoring. So, I would, rephrase that, like, not are we expecting people to move towards, we are expecting that they have and are doing risk-based monitoring. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Cheryl. And in fact, the next question is very related, so I'm going to ask this one to you as well. It's a good question. What if we don't know the risk factors when we design the experiment? Can we modify the design after we identify the risk factors for the trial, after the trial has been initiated? This is because sometimes there may be unknown risk factors until the trial is started. So how does that relate to risk-based monitoring and changing mid-course?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Leonard. I think that is another great question. So, first, for the first part, there is a lot of critical thinking that goes into identifying, the critical to quality factors of your trial and the risk to those critical to quality factors. And also the risk mitigation strategies to mitigate the risk to those critical to quality factors. So this really is a multidisciplinary approach. So, when sponsors are designing the protocol, they really need to involve multiple perspectives. Like the clinical investigators, they need to talk to the data managers, they need to talk to their service providers, they need to get a patient perspective, to help them identify, all these things. And then the sponsor really needs to communicate what's critical to quality to all those involved in the trial so that everyone understands and focuses, their clinical investigators can focus their oversight, service providers can focus what they're doing to ensure that they get right what they need to get right. And all of this really does entail critical thinking. And so from a clinical investigator perspective, you're like I said, you're probably wondering, I think I mentioned this in the presentation, what are some strategies that you can do? And I think it's really essential that you understand the protocol and identify and what has been identified as critical to quality. And it may involve having a conversation with the trial sponsor to discuss, the critical elements. And then it's, really important to assess the risk associated with these critical factors, specifically, to identify which processes at your site are most vulnerable to errors or deviations, and the potential consequences of those risks to the the critical to quality factors. And it really does require anticipating risks before they occur and determining, where more robust site procedures or additional reviews may be necessary. And then in terms of, whether, I think the last part was whether you should adapt, and you most certainly need to be flexible and adaptive throughout the trial, adjusting, your processes and procedures as new risks emerge, and to ensure the quality and that safety are not compromised. So I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Cheryl. No, I think that was a very comprehensive answer. Obviously, I think the emphasis is to try and avoid unexpected risk factors by being discerning and involving many people in the discussion. And obviously, when things do arise, there's some flexibility. So I have another question. This time it's for Miah. Numerous questions regarding delegating study-related activities to the clinical coordinator, site management organizations, including non-research staff and pharmacy staff. What is the investigator's responsibility for overseeing the delegated activity and ensuring that the study coordinator is adequately trained and qualified to perform these activities? So this is a question of oversight and training. Miah?
Hi, this is a really excellent question and actually quite a common situation. It's really quite common practice and acceptable for investigators to delegate certain study-related tasks to employees and colleagues, but also to third parties, such as individuals or entities like site management organizations or like non-research staff, such as pharmacy, that are not necessarily under the direct supervision of the investigator. So even in situations where the clinical investigator may be supported by the sponsor for identification of a third-party service provider, or in any situation where there's delegated tasks under FDA regulations, the clinical investigator retains that ultimate responsibility and is required to maintain appropriate supervision of the trial, ensuring data reliability and protection of study staff or study participants. So when tasks are delegated by an investigator, the investigator is responsible for providing adequate supervision of those tasks delegated, and are accountable for, ensuring regulatory compliance. But given that responsibility, I think the best way to address this is, I would like to point out that something that you would want to consider are aspects that FDA considers, that we focus on during our inspections with respect to adequacy of supervision and oversight. Such as like individuals, whether individuals who are delegated tasks are qualified to perform those tasks, whether the study staff or third-party vendors are receiving adequate training in order to perform that specific task, particularly those when involving critical quality factors. Other aspects, again, like the adequate supervision and involvement of ongoing study procedures. As for specific recommendations or strategies, FDA may provide, suggestions on approaches through guidance documents. However, generally our position is that you identify what best meets the needs and accommodations of your organization so that you can satisfy the requirements of the applicable statutes and regulations. I hope that answers the question, but before I turn it back over to you, Leonard, I would like to point out, I will say that my presentation and the responsibility, as I highlighted, the responsibilities are really a heavy burden. But I would also like to assure that as clinical investigators, your work is the cornerstone of advancing science and medicine. And like with each challenge overcoming in complying with the regulatory requirements and overseeing the numerous study staff and ensuring data quality and subject safety, just generally it's a closer step to breakthroughs in the future of healthcare. So I just want to commend clinical investigators for, their dedication and perseverance. I think that's something I'd also like to highlight, given the heavy burden of as a clinical investigator.
Thanks, Miah. And I would definitely echo that. I think it's a very good point that we certainly understand the burden on investigators. And obviously, we very much appreciate their role in clinical drug development. So let's change gears a little bit. And I have a question here for Casa, a challenging question in my view. For international clinical trials, what takes precedence, international or local regulations? Casa, any thoughts?
Thank you, Leonard. And both are very important, and the clinical investigators are expected to abide by both regulations, and there is no contradiction. And there may be that we do appreciate there are regional differences in terms of regulatory expectations, and clinical investigators are expected, depending on the type of study that they are involved with, whether it's an IND based study or an NIND study, to meet the expectation, the global standard. Whether if it is an NIND study, we do anticipate clinical investigators to conduct their studies according to GCP. And if they signed up for 1572, the expectation also to meet the FDA regulatory requirements. But in general, even though there may be some differences from regulation perspective between different countries. The expectation by FDA is to have clinical investigators meet the expectation by both FDA as well as the local regulatory requirements. Leonard, I hope that answers, and they are complementary, not contradictory in general.
Yeah, thanks very much, Casa. I think that's obviously a very sensible way to approach this. I mean, people have to respect the regulations wherever they apply. I have another question for you, Casa. Also, I think a lot of interest in international implementation of trials. What kind of inspection, or how, I guess, are the steps taken to inspect and validate foreign data? So really in question on how we implement inspections on foreign data.
All right, thank you, Leonard, for the question again, and that is a very important. And the inspectional approach that we use here in the US as well as across the globe are very similar, but they take into account the various contexts that may come with this particular clinical study and the particular region. And we do on-site inspection, but before any inspection, actually, there would be a lot of work preparing for the inspection. And FDA reviewers look into the data, try to understand exactly at the site level what may have transpired or what may have occurred, and also the importance of that particular site in terms of reported data to the FDA, and gather information, and then inspection would be planned. And one of the main reasons for the inspection is to verify the reliability of data submitted to the marketing application to FDA. Therefore, inspectors will, whether it is remotely or on site in person, they verify the data submitted with the source records that are available at a particular site. Of course, the operational approaches are changing, and people have been talking about clinical trials with decentralized elements. And in those instances, we would try to locate the best place where we can verify the data. That's what I would say, Leonard. Back to you. Thank you very much again.
Thanks, Casa. So I guess in general, the same principles as we apply locally. Cheryl, I'd like to turn back to you with a two-part question. Let's see if we can unpack this one. When a sponsor provides an electronic system to the site for use during a trial, for example, an ECOA, what, if anything, should the site ask the sponsor to ensure the electronic system is fit for purpose and that it meets 21 CFR Part 11 requirements? So in other words, the question is, what should the site ask of the sponsor to ensure that the system is fit for purpose? And the second part of the question, which I can repeat later, is if there's a data integrity issue specifically related to the system that the sponsor provided, could the site receive a 483 warning letter for the data integrity issue? So could the site be held responsible for the system that the sponsors implemented? Able to tackle that one, Cheryl?
Yes, thank you. And that is really, honestly, an excellent question, because we do get this question a lot. And, we recently put out a guidance, I think it was in November of 2024, on use of it's a final guidance, use of electronic systems, electronic records, and electronic signatures in clinical investigations. It's a Q&A guidance. And, that guidance does address the responsibilities for these systems and ensuring that they're fit for purpose. So I'll explain the fit for purpose assessment next, but I do want to talk about who's responsible for ensuring that a system is fit for purpose. And in the guidance, we do address that, and we talk about this in terms of who is deploying the system. So if a sponsor is deploying a system, and this includes any system that they have contracted a service provider to provide, they need to ensure that that system is fit for purpose. They need to do the assessment, and that it does what it intends to do in that, for the purposes of that clinical trial. The investigator site has the responsibility for using that system appropriately, and using it according to the training that they received. And so in terms of like a 483 citation, if there's something wrong with the system design, or the system doesn't have adequate audit trails, or the system is not capturing the data in a way that we can tell that it's attributable, it's unlikely that the site is going to get a citation. We're going to go back to the sponsor who was responsible because they deployed that system. However, if the site uses the system wrong, if they're sharing passwords, and other people are entering data under someone else's password, or they're doing something where they cause the data quality issue, then most likely the site will be cited. If you review the system that the sponsor is deploying, and you see that it doesn't have appropriate audit trails, or you have questions about something, then you could go back and discuss these with the sponsor. But really, it's going to be the sponsor. It falls on the sponsor's responsibility to ensure that that system is fit for purpose if they deployed it. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Cheryl. I think that's a very clear answer. I mean, there's aspects which the sponsor is clearly responsible for, and there may be aspects in implementation which the site carries the responsibility for. Miah, I have a question for you. It's a simple one, but obviously important answer. If we need assistance with filling out clinicaltrials.gov forms, who can we contact? Any advice there?
Yes, that's actually a really great question. I do have a simple answer for that, as well as maybe I might expand. So it's a great question. So in the simple answer is you would contact NIH at register@clinicaltrials.gov, which is an email address, and you would contact them directly through email. The elaborated question is, like as I was noting in the presentation, the primary responsibilities are split between NIH, NLM, and FDA, and FDA being responsible for compliance and enforcement activities. But NIH is responsible for maintaining the database itself. So that's the reason why the primary contact for submitting information to clinicaltrials.gov, you would be working directly with register@clinicaltrials.gov. So you'd be, as if you have questions about regulations at 42 CFR Part 11, or questions about how to register or how to create an account through PRS, any technical issues, you would contact them directly. I also do want to take this quick moment because I recognize that during my presentation, I did not speak to the types of compliance actions that FDA may take. So I just wanted to take this quick opportunity to expand on that. So at FDA, we take a risk-based approach to prioritizing compliance and enforcement actions. So essentially, like prioritizing those that pose the highest or greatest risk to public health. So we might issue a preliminary notice of noncompliance, which you might find on FDA's website, as well as a notice of noncompliance. And the intent is to encourage voluntary compliance. So, for example, like failure to address potential violations of results information reporting, or not registering a trial. These letters are publicly available. So if you go to FDA's website, you'll see that they are available. Again, like so generally, the first step would be ideally voluntary compliance, but FDA may issue a preliminary notice of noncompliance, which without, if you're not addressing those violations, the next step would be a notice of noncompliance and or civil money penalties. So in general, our agency is encouraging sponsors, researchers to uphold their legal and ethical responsibilities in registering and submitting trial results information. Again, I think I believe they posted the link to the 3 parts webinar series in the Q&A box. But again, the short answer was contact them at register@clinicaltrials.gov. Thanks, Leonard.
Thanks very much, Miah, and thanks for expanding a little bit on the communications that we can issue. I think it's very helpful for investigators to understand this. I'm going to turn back to Casa with an interesting question. This is very perceptive. Different ethnic groups in clinical practice need to be considered. We did a clinical trial in Asia and Europe. Could we use such data to represent such ethnic groups in the US? Casa, any thoughts?
Thank you very much, Leonard. And yes, indeed. I mean, as everybody knows, if the emphasize and one is that, I mean, it's going to help us in having the ability to generalize the study results for the people across the globe. Of course, the equity issue also may be raised. Therefore, wherever it may be, I mean, if they encourage clinical investigators and others to include diverse patient population. And I think I saw also a couple of similar questions, Leonard, along that line. And just what I want to emphasize is diversity, and that we have been emphasizing the need to diversify patients. When I say diversity, it's not only ethnicity, gender, age group, and different kind of groups. I think that helps the strength of the result in terms of the inference that we make on any medical product. That's what I would say. Leonard, back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kassan. I completely agree. I mean, people don't just stay in one place. People travel all over the world. Some come here, some from here leave to other places. So I don't think it makes a difference where you come from. It's just that we get the correct representation of populations with different sort of genetic constitutions, so on. Exactly. So let's see. I think we're almost out of time. I have a long question, but let's see if we can get through some of this. Cheryl, for you. Thanks for an excellent presentation. Can you speak to whether an emphasis on critical to quality factors might affect BIMO, clinical investigator and sponsor investigator inspections? Critical to quality factors might affect BIMO inspections. Could this impact what field investigators focus on during either routine pre-approval inspections or other types of inspections? Any thoughts there, Cheryl?
Yeah, again, another excellent question. So thank you for that question. So yes, it will and it is impacting our inspection assignments. So this is an exercise that we do internally about identifying when an application comes in-house. We work with the review division about identifying what's most important to their review, and we try to focus our inspections on those. And this afternoon, I don't want to, I don't know, bust the balloon or bust the bubble for what people are going to present this afternoon, because you're going to hear a lot more about inspections in session 2 today. But I will say that, we do make an effort to focus on what is most important, to the review division in the review. So, it will impact what the field investigators are also going to look at during inspections.
Great, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of our session here. On behalf of ourselves, the organizers, and on behalf of the attendees, I wanted to thank you folks for an excellent discussion here and excellent presentations. We're going to be taking a break. We will reconvene at 15 minutes past the hour, so you have 25 minutes to refresh yourselves. And this afternoon's session will be led by my colleague, Kim Smith. Thank you.